Hello and welcome. This is Coaching as Benevolence, a podcast for people who are curious about using coaching for self-development. I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings Grief and Loss Coaching.
And I'm L'Shawn with Michelle Sage Place Positive Intelligence Coaching. So today we are going to talk about a topic that I personally love, and that is curiosity. And we're going to talk about how, of course, just like we do in the other episodes, and talk about how it shows up in our coaching, how it shows up in our personal life. And we're going to suggest ways that you can apply it to your daily life as well. So Eryn, curiosity, what comes to mind when you hear that word?
Well, last night we watched the last episode of Lessons in Chemistry on Apple TV. And at the end, the main character talks about how science is similar to kind of just the mystery of life in a way, and that we have to look backwards sometimes to see the thread or the through line through all of our experiences to make meaning and create possibly like a hypothesis or also understanding that when we do look back, we have the wherewithal to do so. Whereas if we're trying to solve a problem in the moment, or we're trying to create a hypothesis in the moment, we're still very much in the dark. So really, it just goes back to that idea that questions lead to questions and lead to questions. And I remember when I went to grad school, I thought, well, I was going to get all these answers about equity issues in education that I was very curious about. And of course, it led to more questions than answers. So when I think of curiosity, I think of this piece of, as soon as you open and expand your mind to curiosity, then more questions come about. What about you, L'Shawn, with curiosity? How do you relate to it?
Well, I think similarly, and I love that you use the word expand, because I feel like when we leverage curiosity, we expand. And I think that's one way that we can expand our mind, we can expand our experience through curiosity. And one of the things that I particularly love about it is that it does bring a sense of joy, a sense of wonder, a sense of, I would say, discovery. Because when you're curious, when you have that curiosity, there's a lightness to it. And it's about exploration. And as you said before, when you were referencing that show that you watched the last episode of, the idea of, well, when you were talking about the thread, I was thinking hindsight is 2020, right? When we look back at something, it's very clear. Oh, I can see why this led to this, led to this, led to this. But when we're in the moment, problem solving, we are in the dark. And I think that it's easy to get really, to get stressed out when you're in the dark, when you're facing the unknown. Whereas when you approach it with curiosity, it gets rid of that stress, for me anyway. And that's one of the things that I love about curiosity, is that it brings in like the joy of discovery. What comes up for you?
I like how you related it to the unknown, because curiosity does that. It helps us explore the unknown with some buoyancy, and it also helps us relate to people with less judgment. And I think that's really neat that curiosity has so much flexibility in how it can positively influence our lives, not only through our experiences, but in our interactions with other people. And I know in a previous episode, I said, I'm going to really apply curiosity at the holidays to family members. And I did that. And I, like you have said and talked about in the past, you feel different, right? When you're engaging in conversations from a level of curiosity. And then the other thing that I've noticed over the past year is that people tend to kind of go along with their first thought, not always, but our brains trick us sometimes into thinking that's the best plan rather than saying, okay, here's where I'm at with my thinking. And now I can ask more questions about it. And now I can apply that coaching approach to ask more questions about it so that my mind might completely come up with a different idea that is maybe somewhat similar or a lot different than the original thinking that we hold. So I've noticed that too, just in observing uh, just people and the way that we work in society, and just have been more curious about how do we in the moment move our thinking quickly with curiosity to be able to respond to those interactions between one another. So that came up for me over this, the past holiday and also over the past year. um yeah, what about you, LaShawn?
Well, I like what you're talking about, like in terms of like how we can um like approach situations and people or interactions with people with curiosity. I love that you said non-judgment. I love that word buoyancy too as well. And I think that and the feeling. I really want to like hone in on the feeling just to make it more into like a physical experience as opposed to like an intellectual experience. And that is really understanding how when we are in a curious mind or when we are in curiosity mode, um, it does change the way we feel. And some of the emotions that come up for me, the feelings, the sensations that come up for me when I'm curious is I feel like I'm kind of at the edge of my seat. I feel like I'm, um, bouncing, buoyancy. I feel really, again, I want to come back to that joyful, um, really excited, thrilled. Um, there's a sense of wonder as well. So, what are some emotions that come up for you when you um, when you have when you're in a curious mind, or even like if you could recall the emotions that you felt this past holiday when you were using curiosity?
I really like that question. And I think first it shifted me back into gratitude. So, feeling grateful. I also think that when I approach things with curiosity, I feel anticipatory, but not in an anxiety inducing way, in an exciting way, in a joyful way. Like you said, using the word joyful. When I use curiosity, I also feel confident in my abilities to problem solve or to move through life, or even just be me, because it helps me feel like I'm judging myself less even. And I think what I really like about curiosity is it's a tool that anybody can access at any stage of their lives, whether you're a child all the way to 100 plus. But it is also a shift in thinking and a shift in way of being and a shift in feeling to move into curiosity as kind of a part of your daily habits. So I know you probably have a lot to talk about with the positive intelligence in relationship to making curiosity a habit. Uh, is that something you want to talk about now, or do you want to stick with the feelings piece and talk more about feelings?
So I'm happy to go to talk a little bit about how curiosity shows up in positive intelligence. I talked about before in previous episodes about the idea of the sage. So in positive intelligence, we embody or we personify uh, the different traits that we have that serve us and don't serve us. And the traits that don't serve us, those automatic behaviors, thoughts, ways of approaching stressful, challenging situations, are personified as our saboteurs. And the antithesis of our saboteurs is or the antidote to our saboteurs is the sage. And the sage is your inner self, your um, the part of you, the inner wisdom, going back to benevolence and how that's a kind having to do with wisdom and kindness. That is also part of the sage. Curiosity is a huge part of the sage. The sage has 5 powers, and the one of the 5 powers of the sage is explore. And explore is very attached to curiosity. You can't you can't use explore unless you're in a curious mode. And one of the things that we do with explore is we have these power games that come with the powers of the sage in order to access those powers that we all have, and that we become the fascinated anthropologist in explore. And we look at our situation from an objective view, and we see it more as, oh, what's going on here? And we get curious about what is happening. And when we get curious, when we even use the word curious, and I find that when I work with my clients, if I say, oh, I'm curious, then it opens up to, hey, we don't know the answers here. We're not in fix it mode. We're in explore mode. We're in let's find out what's happening here. Whereas it's a kind of a letting go of the outcome, and you let go of fixing it, that idea that we need to fix it. We need to problem solve. This isn't really problem solving mode, although it's part of the process. We're really just focusing on what's out there. And going back to what you said about questions, lead to more questions. But when you're in that curious mode, when you're in that explore mode, when you're the fascinated anthropologist, you want more questions. You want to know more. You want to see more. You want to expand. And so your focus then becomes not finding the answer or the solution, but just exploring, learning. And that, I think, is part of curiosity. Learning is part of curiosity. What comes up for you, Eryn?
I like the idea of framing curiosity with learning and exploring, especially thinking about how we feel when we explore. It's almost easier for me to answer how I feel when I'm exploring than how I feel when I'm curious. So that I'm a little bit now more curious about, because I hadn't thought about that until we've had this conversation right now. Because when I'm exploring, right, there is a joy and a detachment from, like you mentioned, outcomes, but also findings, right? It's just like whatever you happen to come across, you appreciate with what it's brought to you, or what it's brought to me, I should say, instead of using you. And so I think that's really neat that curiosity can also open us up to that sense of exploring, and whatever's being brought to us in the moment is such a gift. And it's kind of like gratitude, but it's also a little bit different. And so that's where I go kind of when I think of this exploring piece. And then learning is always, part of the human condition, whether or not in terms of how we approach life. We are constantly learning and taking in new information. And I guess I want to discern a little bit between taking in new information and learning. When we're in the curious mode, that's when we're able to approach one another, information, ideas, with a sense of learning, and a learning within ourselves to expand our own thinking, our own belief systems, our own ways of being. So I really like this idea of framing learning with curiosity in that way. And then if we're just taking in information and mindlessly scrolling through information, or not really sitting with the information, I can see how judgment becomes such an easy kind of habit that just continues to form and kind of gets instilled in us. And it's like, how can I sit there and break that habit of judgment to move into more curiosity there? So that's where I went with those two concepts of learning and exploring. And I want to, I guess, hopefully I can frame this question okay. But somebody once told me, they're like, we know you like curiosity And you've certainly heard this phrase, and I know this is cliche, but curiosity kills the cat. Isn't that true? Can there ever be too much curiosity? So I guess that's my question to you, LaShawn. Can there ever be too much curiosity?
Well, part of me says yes. I think there can be too much curiosity. I think when I think about that saying, "Curiosity killed the cat," it's almost like um, when we explore, especially the unknown, it's easy to get not distracted. I would say get really hyper focused in the figuring it out rather than, and maybe not be aware of dangers or things like risks and things that can come up. So when I think about curiosity killing a cat, it's like this comes up a lot with, detective movies and stuff like that, where they're getting too close to the truth, or they're getting and the people around that are protecting the truth are, they start attacking or going after the detective or whatever. So I think that saying is very interesting. And I do think, can you be too curious? Is there such a thing as being too curious? I want to say no, because to me, I approach life as this I don't know, school or lessons, like it's all about learning. And I think that the more curious I get, or if I remain curious, the better it is for me mentally to approach life, or to get through life. Like when I switch from analytic, trying to find the solution, when I switch from that to really focusing on exploring and learning, it's just easier for me. It's like less pressure. So can you be too curious? And the whole saying of curiosity killed the cat, I think that saying is indicative of maybe a fear of the unknown, a fear of where curiosity can take you. And I think it's a warning. Like if you're too curious, you might find something out you don't want to find out, or you might get into a situation where it can be potentially fatal in terms of killing the cat. And it's interesting that it's a cat, that it's a feline. So that's another thing that's really interesting for me. There's so much, as with so many sayings, there's so much in there. It's so loaded. But yeah, where I would say that those sayings, I think, are put into place to warn mostly children from exploring too much, because you might get into an area where, one, you can't handle it, or two, it's more than you really wanted to know. But at the end of it all, if you think about what curiosity, the benefits of curiosity, I would say, I don't think you can have too much curiosity. What do you think, Eryn?
I agree with you in everything that you said. And, like anybody can apply any piece to that phrase potentially, like judgment killed the cat, right? And so, yes, too much of anything can sometimes be a bit of a hindrance in some ways. And yet, yes, as you mentioned with children, it's a way to maybe frame in a way that I wouldn't use that violent language probably with my younger children, but a way to frame, boundaries that keep them safe. So on the other end of that, as we grow into adulthood, we can take that shift in thinking, right? Where those boundaries are really much put on us by society and adults and things like that. And we now, are doing our own boundary setting, right? And so it's interesting because with curiosity, to be able to set those boundaries, I need to stay in curiosity, in a curious mindset, right? And I don't want to keep thinking about this so binary, but if I approach my own boundaries with very strict judgment, then there's a lot of rigidity in my thinking and my approach to what I can allow into my life that might potentially be helpful and supportive. And yes, there will also be things that come in that are not those things, right? That are unhelpful, and not supportive. And that's where I find curiosity, especially in grief and loss, the most empowering. Because when those things come into my life, if I approach that with judgment, I find myself often stuck in places of despair. And if I can approach myself with curiosity, not accepting whatever the bad behavior of something else or whatever, but accepting, my movement through it with curiosity and non-judgment, then I think I expand my ability to live the life that I want to live and live a good life. So I like this idea of, those phrases are definitely more for childhood and thinking about how we bring those sayings into adulthood to hold them with some level of meaning, especially if, they have been impactful in various stages of one's life, but also to recognize, I think curiosity equals adulthood. And it's interesting because usually curiosity is childlike, right? And it very much is. But that's where I go with it. I think this like growing up kind of feeling. What about you, L'Shawn?
It's really interesting that you should bring up adulthood, because I thought also about the idea of expansion, of growth. And I do believe that to take a curious approach to a problem or to a challenge or to life in general is quite mature. I think it takes a maturity to let go of reactive mode and shift. I think it's a shift, like you were saying, it's a perspective shift. It's a shift in mood. And I do believe that it takes a certain maturity to do that. So when you said that curiosity equals adulthood, I'm right there with you. Although when I embody curiosity, I often embody the kind of mind of the child, the child exploring the world, out in the woods, figuring out what's under that rock. What would that feel like if I, took my shoes off and I, went barefoot in the grass? Or I wonder what that bark tastes like. That kind of unbridled desire to learn through all your senses. So when I think of exploration, when I think of curiosity, I often do think of the mind of a child. However, I do believe that there is definitely some wisdom and, well, there's a lot of wisdom and maturity in curiosity. And I wanted to kind of go back to what you said, because you mentioned in your grief and loss work and in the coaching that you do. I wonder, and I wouldn't be surprised if our listeners also kind of felt this way, like they're like, listening to us and be like, yeah, that's all well and good, but what about heavy issues like loss, grief and loss? So where does curiosity show up in helping to get through grief and loss?
Yeah. I think of curiosity like a shield in grief and loss, in that we typically live in a pretty grief illiterate culture and how to support one another. So it can be really hard as the griever to interact with individuals and feel a lot of judgment toward them. And those feelings are valid and okay, right? And yet, when we put on the curiosity shield, we can approach the situation with curiosity, which helps us maybe feel, I don't know, less pain, less difficulty and despair in those really hard moments of life. And then it also turns inward because I think when we grieve, sometimes a lot of things get very exasperated into black and white types of thinking because our brain is creating this whole new map after a big grief experience or during a big grief experience. So it's like, how can we take those big thoughts and big feelings and tend to them with small curiosity, right? It's not that we're going to go exploring on a large scale. Like, sometimes curiosity really may work that way, and it really may play a pivotal part in people's lives in that way. But it's something, I think it's more about tending to the inner way of our thinking and feeling and holding things lightly. And I think you mentioned that earlier about holding things lightly that are just too big to hold so heavily and so tightly. And I think curiosity also takes us to two other things with grief and loss. One, when we have a large, grief and loss experience, we often are completely changed. Not completely, we are often changed. We're always changed, right? as the way we're always constantly changing as humans. But in response to grief and loss, we do typically have a change. There's an impact. And so when we can start to be curious about that, that expands our ability to open up to new joys and new insights, new hopes, a better way of living than what we were living before, those types of things. And I don't want to say all this stuff too lightly because I know that there is this very important space for sadness, right? But even being curious about our sadness just expands us to our experience. So I think those are the ways that I think of curiosity and grief and loss. And I think it's a very important tool to utilize, whether that's to help with those thoughts and feelings or to consider ways to be hopeful or ways to protect yourself or those types of things. So that's where I go.
Yeah. As you were talking, I remember like I think it was one of our first conversations about grief and loss and how you say that, that changes a person. And also you used the word like open to things. And it reminded me of what you said about being broken open. And there's a lot of like, there's a sense of opening up and expanding. I think that is something that curiosity allows. It allows that opening up. I think it's like a softening of the mind. Like you said, rigidity was another thing that you mentioned as well earlier on. So it's really interesting, and I'm really used our word our word of the day, curiosity. I am really curious to know, because this is something that I am still learning. How does one, when they are, and you used this word before, I believe, companioning a griever, or they're supporting someone who's grieving, how could we use curiosity internally and also externally? You did mention those three things that you think about when you are supporting a griever, and one of those things was like thoughtful questions and showing care and offering resources. So, like, where does curiosity come when it's about supporting a person who's suffering, or supporting someone who's grieving?
Yeah. I think in addition to, I think curiosity is kind of woven through those three that you just mentioned. And I think one of the best places it can be helpful for the person supporting a griever, companioning a griever, is their own internal responses. So, I'm feeling and thinking this, well, why? How is that supportive to the person? Is this how I feel about the situation? It's probably not how they feel about the situation. Kind of just really interrogating our own thinking and feeling as a first step can be really helpful. And I think also being curious is like the consistent companioning. So you'll see the griever evolve and shift and change over time and deal with really difficult emotions or have them and some really hard thoughts as well. Uh, so it's kind of like that lightly and that buoyancy of being beside them through all of that. And instead of approaching them with a judgment, right, you can approach them with the curious questions we talked about, with that 3 kind of grief care model. So I think that's another way, is recognizing how you can be responsive with questions and support, rather than, approaching your support with judgment and as somebody who holds all the knowledge too. Like, being curious as a companion, somebody who companions a griever, it also means you're doing your research, right? Learning about what research is out there, and all of those sorts of things. So, in addition to all the work that the griever is doing, your curiosity shows up as a lot of the inner work that you're doing yourself and the questions that you ask as well. Yeah, curiosity is not only a helpful tool for somebody going through a grief experience or even looking back at grief experiences. It's also a helpful tool for anybody supporting a griever. Yeah, what about, we've talked a little bit about our kids and your support of your daughter with, like, bullying at school or other instances. How has curiosity shown up in those conversations maybe? And do you have any suggestions on how, I as a parent can embody more curiosity when I'm interacting with young people?
Well, I mean, and this is the way that I approach heavy situations with my daughter. Like, for example, if she's dealing with depression, or she's just she's expressing an emotion that she's experiencing, before I would go into fix it mode, and I would be like, okay, how can we make you feel better? And instead, like you were saying, you want to be internally aware of what's going on for you. I'm sure this is the same with, like, companioning a griever. If you're supporting a child, there's 2 things I would say that I am aware of when I am interacting with my children when they're in distress, they're upset. One, I want to honor I want to honor their experience by allowing them to go through it, however they're going to go through it. And I also want to be present with them while they're going through whatever they're going through, whether it's my son upset because he has to go to bed, and he's having a fit, and it's like, okay, you're gonna process through this, and just, again, coming in with that curiosity, be curious about what's going on with me, what's going on with him, how am I responding to his expression of frustration, disappointment at having to go to bed when he's in the middle of a game. And so just being curious about what's happening in this moment and how can I, help him get through this without denying him the experience. And it's the same with my daughter too. She has things that she's going through. I want her to be able to express those feelings and just listen. So I think that mind of curiosity requires a willingness to listen, to sit back. And so you're not just listening to them, you're also listening to what's going on with you too. Like, what thoughts are coming up for you? Like, my daughter will talk about a friend thing, in middle school, friends are so important. And those are often sources of upset and confusion. And so it's easy for me to go to a place of, well, when I was in middle school, I had the same situation. And however, I have to remind myself and be curious about, hey, how is she handling the situation? What are her insights? What are her emotions that she's going through, that she's expressing? So that's where I think curiosity can keep you in the present and keep you from kind of knee-jerk reactions to things that can be upsetting when your kids are in distress. It's very easy to like turn off your, executive functions and go right into the amygdala and like really just slay the bear or whatever, that, but curiosity allows you to stay in that, higher executive thinking where you're able to allow your children to experience whatever they're experiencing. And it also allows them to learn and to trust themselves, I think. If they can trust themselves and know that, hey, I can get through this because I got through this, and being like someone there as a support for your children, I think that's also something that we can do as parents when we're interacting with our children, and we can use curiosity to help us stay present with our children so that we're not going back to, oh my gosh, my child's suffering. I need to stop that suffering. That's just natural and normal to be as a parent, to want your child to stop suffering, and you want to like fix it right away. But it also allows you to have that experience with your child and learn together. Hey, how are you handling this? How am I handling this? Let's talk. Let's explore together, so that it's not I have all the solutions, I can fix this. Because I think we rob our children of the opportunity to learn how they handle a situation, because we're not always going to be there. That was a very long-winded answer.
But you said a lot of rich information. And earlier on in that response, you mentioned something about listening. And it took us about 30 plus minutes into the podcast to bring that word up, listening, which is such a key part of curiosity. I guess if we had a big word web, it'd be curiosity, and listening would probably be the first kind of branch off in a lot of ways. So I really appreciate that you brought that up. And then kind of this fix it mode as a parent, and the way that you address that through your ability to accompany or be beside and listen was really skillful. And I think it'll be helpful to a lot of parents. As you were talking, a thought kind of came up in my mind too about discernment, because discernment is a type of judgment. But to me, curiosity is like good discernment, or curiosity is discernment. So I get a little hung up in some ways when I think of like the wordsmithing of everything, because if you look at the definition of discernment, it's like judgment gone well, or good judgment, or things like that. But when I think of curiosity, I also think of discernment. So do you have any way to help me untangle discernment and curiosity there? Because I'm kind of stuck there.
Well, I think you're on the right track. I mean, I think that discernment is it's an objective. So trying to think of, without using, it is a type of judgment. It's like, but I say it would be like a positive. Man, that it's really just, it's like kind of entangled too. So how can I help? But I really do think that you're on the right track in terms of curiosity, discernment. We talked about listening. I think that discernment is like an objective, maybe even, I would even say like a compassionate approach or view of a situation. But I also think that judgment also has positives too, because you can judge something to be good. I believe that discernment is neutral. What do you think? Is there I would say that there's a neutrality with discernment as opposed to judgment is more of interpretation, maybe?
Yeah, I
What
don't
do
know. I
you
think
think?
it's maybe circular. Like for me to discern, I first need to be curious, but I also need to have the discernment
Mhm.
first to be curious in a way. So I see them as very, maybe the word companion, like they can
Mhm.
companion each other in almost all areas of curiosity. Because we have to utilize a level of judgment to engage in curiosity, but it's also, yeah, it's also, but I guess in the way that my mind has framed these words, I've been thinking of, here's curiosity and discernment over here, and here's judgment over here. And I think that is all the internal work I need to do on the word judgment because of
Mhm.
all the like negative thoughts and responses, both internally and in my mind, that come up for me when I think of the word judgment. Um, so, yeah, I think judgment alone may still be problematic, but curiosity and discernment alone are not.
Mhm.
That's, I don't know. I'm kind of stuck in my thinking and feeling on this one. Yeah.
Well, I think that that would be like a really good thing to kind of put out there to our listeners. You could go to our website and you could maybe, instead of putting a question, you could say, hey, what do you think discernment is? Or what's the difference between judgment and discernment? In positive intelligence, the difference between judgment and discernment is negativity and positivity. It has to do with when you're in judgment mode, you have like negative feelings like, you upset, overwhelm, worry. Whereas when you're discerning, you have feelings like calm, you know, compassion, that kind of thing. So it's really differentiated in terms of what you're feeling when you're in judgment mode or discernment mode. And one is of the saboteurs and the other one is of the sage. However, I think just like I'm curious to know, maybe we can expand um, our idea of discernment and judgment. I know that when I think of discernment and judgment, I'm not looking at like the dictionary definition. I'm going on lived experience and my training. But I'm sure that there are academics and people out there who are listening to us who are like, I know. So please, I would love to know what our listeners think of the difference between discernment and judgment. And, curiosity, what comes up for you when you think of the word curiosity, when you think of the experience of being curious, of exploring. So I think this would be some really interesting conversations. If you're listening to this on YouTube, you can put it in the comments. If you want to go to our website, you can use our form that we normally use for questions, in comments, and you can give us feedback on what you think is the difference.
And you using that word feedback there, I set me off on another thought in my head. Like all those things I told us not to do at the beginning of the episode. Like, don't jump on the first thought, keep expanding that. But this idea of feedback in curiosity, it's always it's a natural process, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
and that's what's really cool too about curiosity, because we do get feedback. And I think that might be my coaching strategy for today is
Mm-hmm.
when we're in curiosity mindset, like just be aware of the feedback you're getting. What are the cues you're getting in nature, in relationships all around you? and experiences, and just being more open to recognizing that feedback as a way to inform your curiosity and then your way of living and being. And yeah, so that's my tip of the day, to be open to the feedback that you get from curiosity.
Yeah, I love that. My tip of the day would be to be observant of the emotions that you feel around curiosity. What does it feel like to be curious, to be, to discover, to be in the mind of exploration? So what does it feel like? So my tip would be to really be aware of your emotions. What are you feeling when you're curious?
I love that one so much. And you brought it up in a way in a couple episodes. And every time you say it, it just clicks in my mind and heart, like, oh, yes, what am I feeling? And just to pause and think about those things is so helpful. So helpful.
Thanks for joining us for Coaching as Benevolence. I'm L'Shawn with Maychelle Sage Place, Positive Intelligence Coaching.
And I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings, Grief and Loss Coaching.
Have a benevolent day.